Hello, I'm Ben and you're watching The PhD Parent. Intrusive thoughts, which are a key feature of Obsessive-Compulsive Disorder, or OCD, are experienced by almost every parent. These thoughts often revolve around harm coming to the kid. For some mums and dads, these thoughts, which are otherwise a normal part of being a parent, can turn into full-blown OCD. In fact, it's suggested that having a kid can trigger the development of OCD or make OCD symptoms worse if you're already experiencing them. OCD can have a significant negative impact on a person's life, and so appropriate treatment is important. A well-supported psychological approach for tackling OCD is exposure and response prevention, otherwise known as ERP. There are other approaches, including cognitive therapy and combined cognitive therapy plus exposure response prevention. But in this video, I'll focus on ERP for two reasons. First, the evidence shows that ERP is about as effective as cognitive therapy and cognitive therapy plus ERP. Second, in another video, I provide a general introduction to cognitive therapy, so it didn't seem sensible to go over it again here. So here is a crash course in ERP for OCD. So one of the key principles in ERP is that distress does not last. That is, if you come across something that results in you feeling distressed, and you do nothing other than sit with that distress, your distress will, eventually, reduce. Building on this principle, the basic approach in ERP involves a person exposing themselves to stuff that they find anxiety-provoking in a graded manner, while not engaging in any behaviours to try and reduce that anxiety. I'll expand upon this in a moment. Now, during this exposure, the person simply sits with their anxiety until it reduces, as a rule of thumb, to about half of what it was to begin with. For example, if your anxiety initially was 8 out of 10, then you would sit with the anxiety until it reduced to at least 4 out of 10. Now, two common explanations for why such exposure is effective in reducing OCD symptoms are, first, by intentionally exposing yourself to situations that make you feel anxious, you habituate, or become accustomed to, the anxiety. That is, you learn to tolerate the anxiety. Second, by exposing yourself to situations that make you feel anxious, your beliefs about those situations can change. For example, you might come to believe that the situations you are anxious about aren't all that bad. Probably a bit of truth to both explanations. As you might imagine, ERP is not the most appealing therapeutic approach because its effectiveness depends upon a person experiencing potentially high levels of distress. Because of this, ERP may be best conducted with an experienced therapist who can appropriately plan treatment and can provide support throughout. In fact, there's some evidence to show that therapist-directed ERP is more effective than ERP that does not involve a therapist. That is a self-help based approach. Now, while ERP requires exposure to situations that elicit anxiety, it's important to note that this exposure typically happens in a graded manner. What this means is that a person starts by exposing themselves to situations that aren't too anxiety-provoking and gradually works their way up to situations that are more anxiety-provoking. One of the reasons for this is that it helps ensure that treatment doesn't become too overwhelming. In ERP, the treatment involves the client and therapist first coming up with an exposure hierarchy, which is essentially a list of exposure tasks, ranging in terms of how anxiety-provoking they are, that the person will do to reach whatever therapy goal they've set for themselves. The remainder of the therapy essentially involves the client engaging in the exposure tasks in and out of session. So the basic approach might look something like this. Step 1, working out where to start. Often people will have several different areas where their OCD symptoms are causing problems. So usually the first thing to work out is where to start. A sensible starting point might be the area that's causing the most problems in a person's life. So let's suppose you have a mum, Jane, who has the fear that she may be contaminated by a nasty germ, which she may then pass on to her infant, who will then get seriously ill. Jane engages in compulsive hand washing when she believes she's come into contact with something that may be contaminated. Let's say the worst thing for Jane would be touching a public toilet seat. So step 2, break it down. The second thing Jane and her therapist would do is come up with a bunch of situations, in this case all of which are related to the fear of contamination, but differ in terms of how anxiety-provoking they are. What Jane needs to end up with are a few situations that elicit mild anxiety, for example 1 to 3 level of anxiety, a few that elicit moderate anxiety, for example 4 to 6 level of anxiety, and a few that elicit high anxiety, for example 7+ level of anxiety. Now sometimes you need to be quite creative when doing this, as there may be certain fears a person has that don't readily lend themselves to exposure tasks. In such cases, imaginal exposure can be an effective alternative to actual exposure. Step 3, create a ladder. In this step, Jane would give an anxiety rating to each of the situations generated in the previous step and then put these in order from least to most anxiety-provoking. In the following table, I created a graded exposure ladder for Jane. When creating an exposure hierarchy, you want to come up with enough situations so that there are no big jumps in the ladder. That is, you don't want to go from a situation that's a 3 to the next one being a 6. In these examples, Jane is not supposed to engage in hand washing after the exposure. In step 4, do it. So Jane would start with the first exposure task and then gradually work her way up. As mentioned, when doing each exposure task, it would be important for Jane to stay in the situation and not engage in any compulsive behaviours. While there are no strict rules, I've seen it suggested that exposure should last until anxiety has dropped to at least half of what it was to begin with. And repetition is important. Often a person will repeat each exposure task, ideally until exposure to the situation no longer elicits the same high level of anxiety as it initially did. And this can take a few goes. And lastly, it's important to complete one and only one exposure activity at a time. For the moment though, that's it for my crash course in ERP for OCD. If there's anything I've gotten wrong or if you have any questions, then feel free to get in touch. Otherwise, happy parenting.